Good evening. My name is Father Peter Walsh, and I'm Director of Campus Ministry here at St. Edward's. And I just want to welcome you all to this panel discussion, especially to our panelists who will be leading us in an exploration of a topic that is very disturbing, but very necessary. And I think that as a Catholic university, St. Edward's has a real role to play here in bringing information like this available to our larger community, but especially to our students. You know, even though certain aspects of the talk tonight might implicate Catholic officials and the structure of the Catholic Church in the United States in the problem of the sexual abuse of children, as a Catholic university, we're obliged to shed light on that, and we're obliged to think together and to discover ways in which we can provide safer places for our children. But I think also as Holy Cross University, as a university founded in the spirit of the Congregation of Holy Cross, and of our particular mission of educating young people for lives of change and transformation of society, that this is especially appropriate that we're doing it here. Our whole emphasis on educating the whole person, the whole student, and on treating them with dignity and respect, equipping them with the ability to go forth in their lives, to be not only productive members of society, but agents of change where things need to change, that this is especially fitting. So I just want to take this moment to welcome everyone here and to enter into this topic with open minds, but also with a commitment to social justice and to the ongoing and increasing respect for all people in our society.
Thank you, Father Peter. As I always do when I moderate a panel, I forget to say who I am. I'm James Puglisi, and I'm the Associate Director of Campus Ministry. So we're going to introduce, we're very fortunate to have the panelists that we do, and we brought them in from Florida and everywhere, so we're very fortunate. So I'm going to let them do the introductions so that you can hear their voice and become a little bit more familiar with them, and then we will start into our presentations.
Hi, if this is working. I'm Janet Heimlich, and thank you so much for having me. I am here because I wrote a book called Breaking Their Will in 2011, which looks at the issue of religious child maltreatment. When I get to the podium, I'll talk about just what that is and how we recognize it and what children are at risk. But just quick, I've been a journalist for a pretty long time. I reported as a freelancer for National Public Radio for 8 years, and written nonfiction, usually investigative articles for I think about 15 years or so. And with that, I think I'll pass the mic over to Carla Cheatham.
I'm Reverend Dr. Carla Cheatham, and I will be doing something tonight I don't typically do. I'll be sharing more of my personal story rather than my professional story. My background is in social services, mostly working in child and family counseling and at treatment centers with a lot of adjudicated youth, and also did work in crisis counseling, and for obvious reasons, for me, as trying to overcome what I had experienced as a child, which was abuse that had definitely a religious component to it that exacerbated the impact for me. So I look forward to sharing that story, and I also serve on the board of directors for the Child Friendly Faith Project. So really very grateful that St. Ed's has allowed us to have this opportunity tonight.
Hi. My name is George Mulligan. I'm a member of the Congregation of Holy Cross, the religious community that founded this university. I happen to be a priest. I say that because the congregation is made up of both priests and brothers. I have a theological degree. I am ordained in the Roman Rite, and I also have a master's in social work and a clinical license to practice social work. My area of expertise is family and children. I worked with female addicts who were pregnant or newly delivered of infants, working on a project to ensure the bonding of mother and child and a safe environment for that child with the drug-abusing mother, or I should say drug-using mother. And I because of my work with women who are IV drug users, I became director of HIV services for a community agency. I did that for a long time. I've been a pastor in a parish, cleaning up some of the deficiencies of the former pastor and some of the practices that were not really healthy for the parish. I've been working with Presidium, which is an agency that works specifically in the area of sexual abuse in organizations. We do nothing else but work with sexual abuse issues, working in organizations that serve children. I've been doing that for 6 years, so that's who I am. Oh, and I'm a native New Yorker, if you can't guess by the accent. And very much a New Yorker.
Well, our first presenter, is Janet Heimlich, and if you notice, the title of our program is also the title of her book, which I think she'll probably share a little bit about as well. And just as to let you know, there are copies of it for sale out in the foyer, and she'll be doing some signing later on. So if you like what you hear, there's more to, or if you resonate with what you hear, I should say, there'll be those will be available for you afterwards. So I will let you take the podium.
Well, I want to thank St. Edward's University for holding this symposium. In particular, I want to thank Professor Innes Mitchell and Dr. James Puglisi for being so helpful in allowing this to take place. I also want to thank you all for being here to be open to learning about this difficult topic. And certainly, as was said earlier, I'm available to talk to folks after this if you'd like to speak to me, and I'll put my email address at the end of this talk, so you can contact me that way as well. I'd like to start with this question. Can religion be bad for kids? Or more to the point, can religious belief lead adults to abuse and neglect children? Some people feel that religion has nothing to do with harming children. Rather, as I've been told by some, perpetrators of abuse and neglect are just sick, sadistic individuals who may not understand how to interpret doctrine correctly. They're right to a point. There are cases where perpetrators would commit crimes against children regardless of their beliefs. In fact, many of these individuals will act in tandem, which leads some to question really whether mental illness is even part of it. I've looked at many criminal cases and studies and so forth, and most of the cases I've run across, the individuals are not mentally ill. They're not sick, they're not sadistic. A lot of what we're going to be learning about tonight is not about people necessarily acting out of cruelty, but acting out of what they believe makes a pious individual. Before going further, I want to make clear that a majority of people of faith don't abuse and neglect kids. And many certainly don't justify abuse and neglect with faith. While the headlines can lead us to think the worst, the vast majority of clergy do not molest children. In fact, many faith communities throughout the country are doing amazing things to help kids who are abused and neglected and to prevent those cases from happening. While Pope Francis has been somewhat criticized for lack of action in the past, he has done something that's unprecedented. He has started a panel that includes women and a survivor to take a serious look at the issue of child sexual abuse in the church. But sadly, we must also acknowledge that there are too many children being harmed in the name of faith. According to Marcy Hamilton, who's a law professor at Yeshiva University, the United States has a romantic attitude toward religious individuals as though they're always doing what is right. But the unrealistic belief that religion is always for the good is a hazardous myth. Horrible things have been done to children beneath the cloak of religion. Children have been raped, beaten, and permitted to die excruciating deaths. Here are some examples of what Professor Hamilton is talking about. Earlier this year, Herbert and Catherine Scheibel of Pennsylvania were sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years in prison in the death of their child. 8-month-old Brandon died of pneumonia, and rather than get him to the doctor or hospital, the Scheibels simply prayed for him. The couple belongs to a Pentecostal Christian church that believes in faith healing over medicine. Remarkably, this isn't the first time this couple has been convicted in the death of one of their children. In 2009, they were convicted in the death of their 2-year-old son, Kent, who, like Brandon, died of pneumonia, a treatable illness, after the couple treated him with prayer. In 2008, more than 400 children in the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the FLDS sect, were removed from their homes because the polygamous group was found to be spiritually marrying underage girls to older men. What followed was the largest U.S. custody case in U.S. history. Largest child custody case in U.S. history. The group believed in underage marriage and justified this practice with Mormon-based doctrines. In the end, 11 men were imprisoned on child sexual abuse charges, including Warren Jeffs, the sect's leader. He was found to have raped a 12-year-old girl in the temple while 2 women presided. For many years, we've seen outbreaks of diseases in religious communities due to members refusing to vaccinate their children. This not only leaves their own members vulnerable to life-threatening disease, but the wider community as well. Often the refusal to vaccinate is tied to a group's belief that outsiders, especially governmental agencies, are evil. This map shows outbreaks of measles in 2013. Measles is a disease that can cause pneumonia, deafness, and death. It's highly contagious and has no cure. The red circles mark outbreaks at religious communities and schools, the largest being a conservative Jewish community in Brooklyn, New York, in which 58 people got measles. About a month ago, a couple in Wisconsin who belonged to the Aletheia Bible Church were convicted on child abuse charges. They were the last of a handful of parents to be found guilty of harming their children through excessive corporal punishment. The church was led by this man, Philip Caminiti, who was sentenced to 2 years in prison for conspiracy to commit child abuse after he instructed congregants to punish children as young as infants and toddlers by striking them on the bare buttocks with wooden dowels based on his interpretation of the Bible. Such punishments, used on children as young as 6 weeks old, were administered for such, quote, selfish acts as being grumpy, crying, or making noise in church. Finally, you may not be familiar with the Jewish ritual known as Metzitzah B'Peh. The ritual, which occurs after circumcision, involves a mohel putting his mouth on the baby's penis and sucking blood from the wound. Today, ultra-Orthodox communities still perform Metzitzah B'Peh. Tragically, some babies have contracted herpes simplex 1 as a result, a disease that a vast majority of Americans have. When newborns contract herpes, it can cause brain damage and even death. Since 2000, there have been 14 reports of babies having contracted herpes after undergoing this ritual in New York City alone. Of those, 2 babies died. These are extreme cases, but I can assure you that I've uncovered ones that are even worse. And while it's difficult to get a handle on just how many children are at risk for religious child maltreatment, I think it's safe to say that there are many, many less egregious cases that don't make headlines, and so we never hear about them. How can we begin to understand what's going on here? Well, let's start by covering a few basic definitions. Maltreatment is abuse or neglect. Abuse being an action that leads to or has the potential to lead to harming a child, such as placing a child in a dangerous situation. Neglect is a failure to act when such failure poses harm to a child. There are many risk factors for child maltreatment. Based on my research, I believe it's important to add to this list of risk factors religious and other ideological beliefs. So, what is religious child maltreatment? It's child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. I'm going to repeat that. Religious child maltreatment is child abuse or neglect that is enabled by religious beliefs held by perpetrators, victims, or the surrounding community. Examples of abusive practices include physical or ritual abuse due to beliefs about, say, sinfulness in children, or legalistic interpretations of the Bible and using what is often known as the rod that is discussed in Proverbs. The Aletheia Bible Church is an example of that, and studies, in fact, show that conservative Christians tend to use corporal punishment a great deal based on their beliefs about ridding children of sin. You've probably heard that expression, beating the devil out of him, which is a similar concept. While corporal punishment isn't necessarily classified as physical abuse, most physical abuse starts out as physical punishment. Using one's religious status to overpower victims and procure their silence. We've read many cases in which religious leaders have done this to get victims to comply with sexual demands. Such manipulation can also happen in the home, where a parent might say to a victim, you need to honor your mother and father in all things, as it says in the Bible. Also, interfering with child development through religious indoctrination and isolation is a form of what social workers might consider to be exploiting, a form of emotional abuse, and we'll learn more about that a little bit later, especially when Carla speaks. Spurning or terrorizing using religious messages. So, for example, telling a child that Jesus doesn't love you or you're going to go to hell. And sorry, that was the category that Carla is going to speak about. And I wanted to mention that this morning I received a comment to one of my blogs that spoke to this kind of form of maltreatment. A woman named Amber wrote, "A familiar statement I often heard in my youth was, 'You better have your heart right with the Lord. You never know when Jesus is coming back.' That statement scared the out of me. How do you know if your heart is right with the Lord? If I can't communicate with Him or see Him, how do I know if I was all good? I don't believe a young mind can truly comprehend faith. I don't know if I understand it now." Either way, this statement created a sense of inadequacy, confusion, but ultimately fear. I felt as though every person I loved was saved but me, so I tried very hard to please God. Examples of neglectful practices include failing to provide affection or comfort due to beliefs about the need for suffering and the, quote, sin of pride. Shunning or excommunicating a child, usually that would be an older child, like a teenager, for being disobedient. Failing to provide needed medical care due to beliefs about divine intervention and the power of faith healing. Failing to report abuse to protect the image of a religion, faith leader, or religious community. While the Catholic Church has received a lot of criticism for failing to report abuse, I don't think I've run across one religious organization that has consistently done a good job at reporting abuse to outside authorities. And it's not just religious leaders who feel the need to protect the image of their faith. Many congregants are on board with this idea as well. Many religious organizations have doctrines that pertain to avoiding scandal. And so you have faith leaders and others coming up with all sorts of ways to avoid reporting, including having their own internal trial system, if you will, and investigative teams, people that aren't trained in areas of crime investigation. The problems are that they often result in, when professionals do eventually arrive on the scene and investigate a case, they have a really hard time doing it well because evidence is been lost, people's memories fade, and that kind of thing. In the end, victims don't get help and perpetrators are not held accountable. I want to read a comment, a quote from an article written by Boz Tchividjian. He's the grandson of Billy Graham, and he runs an organization called Grace, which investigates abuse in churches. And this just appeared in a magazine. The heartbreaking reality is that the marginalization of survivors is all too common in the Christian community. I've encountered many abuse survivors who want nothing to do with Jesus because of being marginalized by the very community they had hoped would care most, the church. Just like the priest and Levi in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we are often so quick to embrace rational excuses for why we walk away. When we do this, we marginalize the very lives that God sees as beautiful and infinitely valuable. When we do this, we marginalize Jesus. Which children are at the greatest risk for religious child maltreatment? Are there certain religions that are worse than others? From my research, it actually doesn't matter whether the religion is Christianity or Islam or Judaism, or what kind of religious texts the family might be reading from, or whether they call a deity Jehovah or God or Allah. What it really comes down to is how a community is governed. What I mean by that is, when a child is being raised in a religious authoritarian culture, whether it's a church, a large religious organization, or a single household, kids are at a heightened risk for religious maltreatment. Religious authoritarian cultures share three main characteristics. They maintain a strict social hierarchy, so clergy would normally have a lot more power than everybody else. Men almost always have much more power than women, and children have next to no rights whatsoever. The membership is unusually fearful, and the culture is socially separatist. And social isolation is a big contributor to the problem, even if the group lives in an urban area. Just how does religious authoritarianism affect children? In these cultures, children are extremely vulnerable. And the reason is because they cannot rely on their parents, their chief caretakers, for protection. Let me explain what I mean. As I said before, harm comes from how communities, families in particular, are governed. In authoritarian systems, it's not family cohesion that is paramount, but family obedience. When one or more family members doesn't follow the rules, and there are often many, many rules to follow, they can be punished. For example, they can be shunned or excommunicated. This is a big fear because for many family members, leaving such a community, often one that's quite isolated, it would mean leaving behind their entire social network, and even believing that they'll have no chance at eternal salvation. And so you see families living in fear. You see scapegoating, parents severely punishing their children. In more totalitarian systems, you see children turning on their parents and even reporting them to the leadership. The bottom line here is that family bonds in these cultures are not strengthened, they're weakened. This is not a new phenomenon. I'm no theologian, but according to the New Testament, Jesus seemed to see the breakup of the family as a necessary price to pay if family members didn't believe in his truth. In Matthew 10, Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." I'll give you a more recent example. You may be familiar with the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. They're the ones who protest soldiers' funerals, and they're expressing their anger at America's acceptance of homosexuality. I've been in touch with a young woman named Lauren Drain who was brought into the faith as a teenager, and her father found out that she was dating a man online and kicked her out of the household. Not only that, the church voted to excommunicate her from the community. When interviewed in a documentary, Lauren's father justified his actions by quoting from Matthew 10 and even referred to his daughter as an enemy of his household. While that sounds pretty cold, parents in religious authoritarian cultures are often victims themselves. That's because they're expected to raise their kids according to the rules of the culture instead of relying on their own instincts. This often involves adopting a one-size-fits-all parenting approach rather than taking into account children's individual needs. In this way, parents are frequently torn between their instinctual desire to protect their children and their desire to do what they believe pleases God. Take the story of Abraham and Isaac, where God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son. Fortunately, an angel sent by God tells Abraham he doesn't have to go through with it because God understands that Abraham fears him. Theologians say this story is important because it marks a time when cultures stop practicing child sacrifice. But I'm going to use this story to point out something else, and that is just what it must have been like for Abraham to make the call. Does he kill his own offspring or protect his son and thereby say no to God? It's an agonizing decision for a parent to make. So again, the parent in a religious authoritarian culture is torn between doing what he or she feels naturally is best for the child while being pulled in another direction, which involves harming the child as a way to prove the parent's allegiance to faith. And sadly, members of these cultures are not sent an angel to tell them to adopt a different parenting approach. One reason why we see some of these problems is because some people of faith worry that if they were to change their child-rearing practices, it would mean giving up their religious freedoms. And some take this so far that they essentially sacrifice the rights of children. For example, some religious organizations have claimed that clergy should not report abuse or release records of pedophiles because that would violate the First Amendment of the Constitution. Sometimes the law, the courts, or policymakers have had to step in to protect a child from harm and even death. For example, every state and the federal government has made it illegal to perform genital cutting on girls, also known as female circumcision, even though this ritual is very important to some religious and cultural groups. Courts have taken temporary custody of children to allow them to get life-saving blood transfusions because their parents are Jehovah's Witnesses who worry that if they receive a blood transfusion, it jeopardizes their chance at eternal salvation. Very often, however, courts and the law side with children's pious caretakers. When they do that, I believe they're setting up an uneven playing field where certain children who are being raised by the ultra-pious are denied the same rights as those children who are being raised in mainstream cultures. For example, in 1972, the Supreme Court decided that the Amish could take their children out of school at the age of 14, even though the state of Wisconsin, where the case was filed, mandated that education was required up until the age of 16. The court made this decision after hearing lawyers for the Amish argue that, quote, salvation requires life in a church community separate and apart from the world and worldly influence. I'm guessing the justices didn't know that the Amish, especially conservative Amish, have committed horrific abuses against children, including incest, physical abuse, and emotional terrorizing. Currently, the state of Idaho is debating whether to get rid of a religious exemption that allows parents to not be prosecuted for withholding medical care on religious grounds. Actually, dozens of states have a similar exemption. There's a large religious group in Idaho called the Followers of Christ that have graveyards full of dead children who died of treatable illnesses. To give just one example, a 15-year-old girl who got food poisoning and was not treated vomited over such a prolonged period of time, she died of a ruptured esophagus. And still, lawmakers in Idaho are quite candid that they oppose removing the exemption. To give you an idea of how far some people will go to protect what they believe are their religious liberties, consider what one public figure said in 1990. T. Gerald Witt, who was the mayor of Lake City, Florida, was incensed that his constituents expressed concern about a zealous faith healing group called the End Times Ministry, who wanted to move to Lake City. Residents were so concerned about this group because they had heard that a baby had died from an untreated nosebleed. When he was interviewed on this issue, Mayor Witt told the St. Petersburg Times, "It's maybe necessary for some babies to die to maintain our religious freedoms. It may be the price we have to pay. Everything has a price." Mayor Witt was most likely unaware of a Supreme Court decision that was made in 1944, which the court said, "The right to practice religion freely does not include liberty to expose the community or the child to ill health or death. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow that they are free to make martyrs of their children before they have reached the age of full and legal discretion when they can make that choice for themselves." So what kind of solutions are available to us to try to eradicate religious child maltreatment? Let's start with what we can do legislatively or with policy. I believe that all clergy should be mandated reporters, and there are a number of states that do require that. There are a number of states that exempt clergy from being mandatory reporters. Some states have a loophole where if a member of the clergy hears about an abuse case in confession, he does not have to report it. I believe we should repeal religious exemptions like the one being debated in Idaho. I think it would be helpful to have new protocols for investigating uncooperative religious communities. So for example, with that custody case I was telling you about among the FLDS, where more than 400 kids were removed, the CPS was quite hampered by allowing the mothers to go with the kids when they were being questioned. And as a result of that, Texas changed their policy that said social workers can remove parents from the room. It ended up hampering the case severely to have the mothers there because they were telling the children basically not to answer any questions or make up lies about the sect. And then finally, I think it would be important to have every victim to be allowed a window of opportunity where they could come forward and sue a religious organization, even if it's just for a limited period of time. That has been really helpful with a lot of victims just finding closure in states that have allowed them to do that. I see faith communities as really taking the lead on this issue. There are required policies and procedures by insurance companies that a lot of religious communities have taken up. Many faith communities are very adamant that they need to prevent abuse. But I think that more can be done so that there's better response to cases when they do arise. We're still seeing problems where there's opposition to reporting abuse. I just read that bishops in Italy have stated now officially that they are not legally required to report abuse, which is true. It's not mandatory by law in Italy, but again, I just think that we need to kind of shift things a little bit and see the importance of if victims are comfortable with it, that they report abuse and not just to a religious authority, to a secular authority. I think it would be important for faith communities to do more partnering with governmental agencies like Child Protective Services and law enforcement so they can learn more about the law. And as Carla mentioned, she and I are both on the board of the Child Friendly Faith Project. We're a nonprofit organization that works with faith communities to educate them about some of these things. And some of the things we're talking to faith communities about is, well, take a look at what kind of programs you have for children. How are you teaching them about the faith? And also, what kinds of things are you teaching parents about parenting? I'm going to skim through this one pretty quickly, but I think it's also important for governmental agencies to get more familiar with what's going on in faith communities, get to understand their traditions better, do their homework before they go in and investigate, and also form an ongoing partnership with faith communities so that when there is a case of abuse that arises, there's trust there so that the faith leaders or congregants won't feel so hesitant to pick up the phone and report it. I'm going to skip through to the next slide here. Maybe, though, what all this really comes down to is just acknowledging that children have basic human rights, the rights for needed medical care, for a proper education, and to feel and be safe. Maybe we should be asking questions such as, should children be indoctrinated into a belief system and denied access to mainstream information, as is typical in very conservative communities? Should adults be permitted to engage children in religious protests, issues they don't fully understand? Aren't these examples of exploiting a form of emotional abuse? When it comes to teaching children about faith, maybe we should question some religious stories that we were raised with that may not be appropriate for children. Maybe we should take more time to think about the sons and daughters who appear in those stories. Going back to the story of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham's agreement to sacrifice his son is typically viewed as a testament to his devotion to God. But what if we saw it from Isaac's viewpoint? For instance, we might ask, how did Isaac feel watching his beloved father tying him up and putting him on the woodpile? What were his thoughts when his father reached for the knife? It's interesting, in Rembrandt's depiction of the story, Abraham is covering his son's face. Why would he do that? Was it to spare on the side of seeing his father kill him, or to silence him? After the incident was over, how might it have affected Isaac? Could he have suffered from PTSD? How might it have affected his family? Maybe we should take more time to think about how we perceive society's youngest members. Certainly, there is much scripture that supports the idea that children are important individuals. For example, in the New Testament, Jesus never advocates using corporal punishment on children. And in Matthew 18, he tells his followers to emulate children in their humility. Isaiah 11:6 paints the picture of a peaceful society and envisions children being front and center. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with a goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child shall lead them. Here's my contact information. By just learning and talking about the issue of religious child maltreatment, we can better ensure that a spiritual upbringing is a nurturing experience for every child. Thank you.
All right, we will now hear from Reverend Dr. Carla Cheatham. I just like to say Reverend Doctor.
Carla works just fine. Well, again, this is something that I rarely do. This is more of my personal story rather than my professional story, although the two do weave together quite a bit. So if you are one who prays or sends good energy, I would invite you to do that for me even now, please. So I was raised in a very religious home in a small northeast Texas town where religion was everywhere, usually in the most positive and loving of ways. But my family was quite broken, impacted by mental illness and substance abuse. And the trauma that I experienced was exacerbated by my abuser's use of religious shame to help maintain control of me with a lot of shaming and justification. I have frequently heard things like, "Carla Ann, what must God think of you? Such a selfish and ugly and filthy little girl. God knows all the horrible things that you're thinking about me and will judge you for thinking them. You're so awful, I don't even know how God could love you." These are just a small sampling, for the sake of time, of the lines that punctuated her often violent rages, among other forms of abuse and neglect that I experienced. Fortunately, those words stood in very stark contrast to the God that I also learned about from the cradle in my town and in my home church as a child, a God who was loving and gentle and understood children's imperfections. The God who I talked to as I cried and as I ran out into the woods chasing rabbits and deer and climbing into trees to hide and read books. I would imagine God in a giant rocking chair, holding me as I poured out my grief and even sometimes excitedly talking about my day. I needed a parent figure, and for me, God was able to be just that. Other than the woods, the only other safe place that I had where I could go was church. And it was there that I saw healthy family, especially in my adolescence. I became a little sister to the men and women there and a big sister to their children whom I babysat. And I finally, in watching them, realized that the Cosby Show and Full House were not the only places where healthy families existed, where children were loved and cherished and cared for, and where families didn't abuse or neglect their children. I was amazed as I began to realize exactly how messed up my family was by comparison. My relationship with God was my constant source of comfort and wisdom to help me survive the challenges that my family faced. And I wanted desperately to help others find that same peace in the midst of tragedy. So I threw myself into the church. I participated in everything that I could, and I thrived to an extent until I entered graduate school, and at the age of 21, I met my first partner. I knew I was gay from the time I was a very small child, even before the abuse began. But my faith told me that it was wrong. And so I so wanted to honor God that I spent my life up to that point trying prayer and therapy and anything else that I could imagine to stay, as I called it, straight and single for Jesus. When it finally seemed to me that the bigger sin was to not live as I believe God created me to be, I came out. As you can imagine, in the early 1990s, in my small Northeast Texas conservative community, it didn't go over very well. Family and friends and my church family were less than gracious. I experienced shunning and what I believe to be religiously based verbal abuse by the very first church family that I had turned to for love and acceptance and support as a child when I didn't have it at home. My brother in my actual family asked me if I wanted God to have to strike my partner down dead to get my attention and bring me back to the straight and narrow path. I was compared to alcoholics and pedophiles and drug abusers and adulterers by my church family. I was told how unnatural I was and what an abomination in the eyes of God I was. I was told that my salvation was in jeopardy and asked if I wasn't afraid of hell anymore. And then my mentor, the person in the church to whom I was the closest, who knew all about my experience as a child and as an adolescent in my abusive home, told me that she was shaking the dust off of her feet at my door, which is a New Testament reference to the disciples not carrying anything of a person who rejected Jesus' teachings with them when they left that person's home, not even the dust from their home that would gather on the disciples' sandals. And she said, "I cannot walk this path with you," and she never spoke to me again, which was quite crushing. And I was devastated. So twice now, I had lost family. Each time, God was used as a weapon to justify their abuse and abandonment. Now, I fully believe that my family was just broken, and their abuse and neglect and lack of protection had nothing to do with me. I also fully believe that these men and women of the church who shunned me were truly doing what they believed was the most loving thing possible to save me from what they called my sin. But despite good intentions, despite being well-meaning, abuse is still abuse, and the impact is still very much the same, especially for a child. I wandered without a church home or much of a connection to God for many years. The person who once led Bible studies and prayer groups and went on mission trips was reduced to only being able to sing "Jesus Loves Me," and I seriously doubted whether that was true. I couldn't read the Bible, I couldn't listen to Christian music, I was too terrified of anything that had anything to do with faith because I was so traumatized I could not handle hearing one more time how much God hated me. My options for the ministry I felt were gone, the ministry that I'd felt called to for much of my life, and I felt my life's purpose too was gone. After spending most of my life clinging to God's love, despite my mother's words in childhood and adolescence, I finally doubted God's love for me. So it took many years and quite a journey for me to find my way back to any type of a solid and healthy faith, much less a connection to a faith community. seeking health, trying to find something better than what I had experienced, I pursued graduate studies, receiving a master's degree in psychology and getting certified, as I mentioned earlier, in crisis counseling. I wanted to understand, so I did my thesis on trauma and forms of counseling to help heal it. Surprise, surprise. I received a PhD in health education and researched the potentially positive as well as negative impacts of religion and spirituality on health. For my dissertation, I surveyed 1,000 clergy nationwide from 3 conservative and 3 non-conservative faith communities within the Protestant tradition to find out what most determined their attitudes towards issues of homosexuality once you controlled for religious beliefs. I wanted to understand that there had to be a different way, and how do we find it? During my doctorate, I was in another Texas town where there's another university, and I found my way to an open and affirming faith community, the denomination known as the United Church of Christ. About half the members happened to be gay and about half happened to be straight. And my pastor looked at me one day and said, "You know, Carla, the UCC sure could stand some more good female ministers." I argued with her that I could not be a pastor. My goal since I was 15 had been to become a missionary because I was a woman. I could not be a pastor. She looked down at herself and just laughed. And I argued that I couldn't be a pastor because I was gay. And she looked over on her desk to see the picture of her partner of 12 years and looked back at me and just smiled. And then I finally said, "Joe, you know my background. You know everything that I've been through. I have too much baggage. I am way too broken. I'm damaged goods. Who the hell would want that as their pastor?" And she rolled her chair over to mine and got knees to knees with me. And she reached across and she took my hands and she looked into my eyes and she said, "But Carla, don't you remember? After Jesus' resurrection, the only way that his disciples recognized him was through his scars. In you, in your healed scars, people will see the transformative power of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and who the hell would not want that as their pastor?" So I finally found my way to seminary and received a Master's of Divinity before being ordained as a minister in the United Church of Christ. I served congregations and alternative coffee house ministries for those disillusioned with or neglected by organized religion and helped them heal, often finding their way back to a faith community if they wanted to. I've worked as a hospice chaplain now for 7 years, and I also spend much of my time helping persons at the end of life, many of whom have experienced their own form of religiously based trauma that leaves them fearful about what is coming in the next life, whatever they believe that next life looks like. So I get to help them access their beliefs, to think through what it is they really believe until they can find their way peacefully home. Again, whatever that looks like for them. And I also get to train healthcare workers nationwide, social workers, nurses, chaplains, doctors, how to be with persons at the end of life in a way that honors their religion, their own individual religion, the patient's religion, whatever that may be, and to honor their spiritual dignity, because that's what I believe it's all about. Too many hear the voices and the messages from religion that can say, "You are not worthy." But there are other voices from religion that speak words of healing and gentleness and grace, even in the midst of staunch disagreement about theology and doctrine. And so my hope and prayer is that as we each become more aware of the often well-meaning, well-intentioned, but also misguided ways that we speak to and treat each other in the name of religion, and the tremendous damage that we can do if we are not careful, that we will end religiously based maltreatment, especially of children, so that we can honor religion at its best and also protect it from its worst. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from Father George.
I work for an agency that works specifically in trying to prevent sexual abuse. That's all we work with. We work with organizations, any agency that serves children. And as our goal is to reduce the risk or to reduce the exposure of risk to children so that they would be maltreated, abused, or neglected. So that's the kind of work that I do. I work specifically with religious communities. So I work with communities of men who are involved either in pastoral ministries, in churches, in high schools, in soup kitchens, and social service agencies as a measure to see what the risk is in their agency. Presidium was founded in 1992 by Dr. Dangle. He sat on the board of the YMCA, and they had a horrible incident of sexual abuse by a staff member. And when he went to look at the research, he found very little research done on organizations and child abuse. There were tons of volumes written about sexual abuse within families, but very little done in the field of organizations. So he started to investigate. And he interviewed he looked at 300 cases, over 300 cases of organizational abuse of children. And in that, he discovered that there are certain pillars of institutions that need to be in place if, in fact, you're going to reduce the risk of child abuse. So what I'd like to talk to a little bit this evening about is those pillars and how they reflect in the Roman Catholic Church. I am not well versed in other religions. I work specifically with Roman Catholics, though we work with Greek Orthodox, we work with evangelical Christians, we work with Baptists, we work with Lutherans, we work with the Episcopal Church, we have a worldwide contract with the Salvation Army, and we work with over 128 religious communities of men in the United States, as well as a number of dioceses. So I'm going to be speaking from a Catholic perspective because that's what I'm familiar with, and that's what I feel confident in. So first and foremost, let's talk about one of the most important things in an agency. Agencies have to have policies. They have to have policies and procedures about how they operate, why they operate, and what their mission is. In Catholic circles, what we discovered in our work was that they were lacking, that policies didn't exist, that because of the structure of the church, priests or pastors were pretty much the person in charge of a parish, and a bishop was in charge of a diocese. And they were basically independent contractors, that what they did and what they said made the operation work or didn't work. Underlying their decisions, but, was a thing called canon law. Canon law is the oldest existing law that is operative for the longest time. It specifically deals with the activities, the rights, and privileges of Roman Catholics and how the church operates. Canon law, I'll give you an example. In canon law, up until a number of years ago, you were considered a major. By that I mean you were considered an adult at the age of 12, and you could make decisions. Recently, that was changed to 18. But prior to that, if you wanted to make a decision within the church, and you were 12 years of age, you didn't need your parents' permission, you didn't need anybody's permission if the priest agreed with your decision. Okay? So that was one of the things operating in canon law. It wasn't really a wise law, that law. The second thing recently, and this is what I'm very proud of, is the intentional downloading of child pornography is now an offense where a priest, if discovered he has done that, is removed immediately. There's no more saying Mass, there's no more celebration of the sacraments, there's no more participating in the life of the church. So canon law by itself is neither bad nor good. It's the sense of how does it affect how people relate to each other. That's the most important thing, is how does it connect people to each other, okay? So first and foremost, you need to have policies. Second of all, you have to talk about the screening and selection of your leadership or your volunteers. Catholics get very upset these days if they're going to teach CCD or they're going to coach basketball or they're going to work in the soup kitchen when you say to them, well, you need to have a background check. Oh, I've been doing this for 35 years. Why do I need a background check? You don't trust me, blah, 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 blah. And my response to that is, don't you think we should have the same requirements as the YMCA? I mean, you volunteer at the Y, you're going to have a background check. You're going to have to need some references. You know, the presumption that I think you're evil is not what I'm thinking. I want to know who is participating and representing the church in our activities. So first and foremost, screening. The second thing is, how do we screen clergy or those people who want to be clergy? Okay? What is the process? You know, a good heart and a generous spirit, and I say my prayers, is wonderful. But we need to know that the person entering seminary is healthy. So there are now rules and regulations about selection of candidates for priesthood. So you need to have psychological testing, you need to have reference checks, you need to have a psychosexual interview, you need to have academic degrees. So before you enter into the organization, we have a better sense of knowing who you are, so that we can make the decision whether this is a good person for leadership or it's not a good person for leadership. The problem being is that the next issue is where we get into problems, I think. Part of it is training. How do we train staff? Do people volunteer here? Just show of hands. Okay, when you went out to volunteer, did they tell you the rules and regulations? Did they train you to do the job? Tell you what the expectation was? That's reasonable. The same is true about the training of clergy. How do we train clergy? We believe, and I believe this personally, that the call to ordination is in fact a call from God. But it's a call that needs to be tested. And that's the purpose, is to test the vocation. The problems with our seminaries, or at least I perceive as a problem, this is a George Mulligan, is the sense of the isolation that occurs in seminary training. That oftentimes men are removed from university settings or college settings. They're put into an educational institute that is usually isolated. It's all male. It has their own faculty, and there's very little dialogue. And the word they use is, we're going to form you. Formation is not necessarily a bad word. But when formation happens to kind of undermine the belief system and the experiences that a person has so that they can fit in to what the organization is about, then it's problematic. I would rather that we talk about integration, that we take individuals as individuals, invite them into religious life or into seminary, and then with that, take the person they are and the religious experiences they have, and then intertwine their gifts into the gifts of the church. But that's my own opinion. Second of all, the next thing is monitoring supervision. It is desperate that in organizations, people are monitored and supervised, that there's some sense that we each know what we are doing for each other, okay? So that when I'm doing something, I have a supervisor. I have a boss. Now, in religious life, I have a boss too. He's called my local superior. Now, my boss at work has a whole kind of agenda of what she can judge me on and make when she evaluates me. It's a basic job description. And I'm accountable for that job description. And if I don't do my job, I get told I'm not doing my job. The problem is accountability within the church, is that oftentimes priests and bishops see themselves as contracted workers, singularities, that they make the decisions. They're the boss. They're there. The problem with that is that who are they accountable to? So when bad decisions are made, who did they talk about it with? Who challenges them to think differently, to act differently, to provide different means? My brother-in-law is more accountable to my sister than I am ever to my religious superior. My sister knows when he comes and he goes, what he's up to, how much he makes, what he has in his bank account, their bank account. The same can't be said about my superior knowing everything that I do, even though I do give him a list of where I am this week. Okay? There's that sense of independence in ministry that really needs to be more collegial. It needs to be more community-based. It needs to be dialogical. By that I mean there's constant conversation going on. And that monitoring supervision. Okay? In order for abuse to occur, certain things have to happen. First and foremost, you have to have somebody who's an abuser, who has passions, who has a trigger in that direction sexually, that they find sexual gratification in children. Second of all, there has to be a victim. There has to be somebody out there that that person has access to. And third of all, there has to be the lack of a capable guardian. And then there has to be privacy, a private space. But those are the four things necessary for abuse to occur. And when you look at church situations, you need to ask yourselves, what is that? Who's the capable guardian? Where is the access of space? Okay, where do these events take place? So now when I talk to priests and clergy, if there's not a glass panel in their office door, that's one of the first things we talk about is, why don't you have a panel on this door? Why can't I see into your office? You know? Well, you know, it's confidentiality. They can sit with their back to you. Are you saying to me this person came in a side door, or did they walk past the secretarial desk? Are you promising people confidentiality in everything you do? The only problem with confidentiality that I have, to be quite frank with you, is in a confessional. Other than that, I don't have a lot of confidentiality, even as a social worker anymore. Those laws are going by the wayside. So the thing is when you look at a situation within a church situation, you have to see those avenues where risk exists, and how do we reduce that risk. Second of all, well, not second of all, next there needs to be a feedback system. There needs to be some way of saying to people, you're doing a good job, you're not doing a good job. There needs to be a point where there is dialogue going on. This is good, bad, or indifferent. So you may have an issue of Sunday school and letting kids out. I'll give you a story. I had working with a young Asian priest. Nice guy, really a nice guy. But if you know anything about Asian culture, they tend to be very private. And they don't like a lot of closeness, to put it mildly. And he was in Hispanic parish, okay? How do you think that went? So they come out of church, the kids, and they just attack him. They jump all over father, because that's what they're used to. You know, there's nothing wrong with that in their minds. Well, he was freaked out. So the next week, he says, well, how do I handle this? He says, because I want the kids to like me. I want to be present. I don't want to, be standoffish. I want them to know they can talk to Padre. But I can't have them hanging on me. It ain't going to happen. And so the next week they come out of Mass and they come running, and he goes, stop. And he says, in my culture, and I'm from Asia, he said, when we say hello to people or we show respect to somebody, we do this. And he put his hands together and he bowed. The kids were like, oh, this is cool. We can do this. And the kids lined up every week since then, and they bow to Father. And he bows back. It's a win-win situation. The kids know that Father likes them, and Father is real comfortable that he's not involved with kids that would in any way be misinterpreted by anybody. Okay? So it's simple things like that you can reduce risk and exposure to risk. The other thing is consumer participation. Every organization needs to get feedback from the consumer, okay? And believers are consumers. I'm sorry I'm using business talk here. But as a member of the community, as a faithful person, you want to give back to your clergy whether or not you think they're doing a good job or whether religious ed is a good job. You want quality in your parish or church. That's why the feedback is there. Oftentimes in Roman Catholic communities, there is no feedback. Absolutely no feedback. The priest does what he wants. There might be a parish council, okay? if you've got a pastor who is interested in what's people thinking. But again, it's only advisory, okay? So the thing that you need to do is that they're not getting the feedback they need to hear, okay? And because they're not getting feedback, they may think everything's going okay, and that is risky at every level. The problem is in the Catholic Church, we talk about laity and clergy. Those are the two caste system. Those who are ordained, and by that I mean bishops, priests, and deacons, they're clericals, they're clerics, and everybody else, the baptized, so to speak. The rights of the cleric supersede the rights of the laity, okay? And that's done not only by canon law, but it's done in dogma that has nothing to do with revelation, okay, what we believe to be God's word to us as believers. And we built up these traditions and practices that alienate laity from clergy. And we need to really get rid of those, that separation. It's not really healthy. When I was in family therapy, one of the things the professor said to me that I use all the time in my work is, adults can talk about anything. We may not like it, it may make us uncomfortable, it may embarrass us, but as an adult, we can say to each other, to another adult, I'm not talking about children, what needs to be said, and to make that person hear us. And I think the same thing is true in the church. We need to treat each other as adults. You know, it's funny at work because the people will call me father every now and again, and they're not doing it because they're big believers, let me tell you. But they'll say, oh, yes, father. And I turn around and I say to them, yes, my daughter. Yes, my son. You know, I can pay the paternal priest if I have to. It's not a role I like, but I can do it if I have to. Those are the things Presidium says need to be part of your organization. You need to have policies, you need to have screening, you need to have training, you need to have monitoring and supervision, you need some sort of feedback system, you need consumer participation, you need a method of responding, you need to know what to do when something goes wrong. What is set up so that you are a mandated reporter? The religious organizations or the brothers and the priests that I work with, and there's over 128 congregations that we work with, every one of those members are in fact a mandated reporter. To be accredited by Presidium, you have to state in your policies as a religious community that you're a mandated reporter. And not only do you have to say that in your policies, you have to do an hour-and-a-half training for each member on how to be a mandated reporter in the geographical region in which you live. So it's not only an idea, it's a practice. And that's very, very important. And finally, what are the administrative practices? In other words, how does the whole thing gel? How does it all work as one? That it is a child-serving organization. That your mission to children is in fact incarnate in every member who works for the company or for the church or for the organization. There's some things I do want to be specific about because I think they need to be heard, especially at a Catholic university. Part of the whole issue of sexual abuse has to do with how we are comfortable in our sexuality, how our skin is, what we know about sex, how it operates, both at a biological level and at a psychological level. When you look at the data on priest abusers, they had problems with intimacy defects. In other words, they didn't know how to be intimate. And I don't mean about genitally intimate. I mean about intimate, about sharing who and what I am to another human being. They didn't have the words, they didn't have the language, they didn't know how to do it. They didn't have the courage to do it. They didn't have the maturity to do it. And because of that, they may have been chronologically 27 years of age, because you have to be 25 to be ordained, but at 27, they're hanging around with a 13-year-old, and you're saying to yourself, what's wrong with this picture? And you finally put it together that's saying he's chronologically 27 years old, but emotionally he's a 12-year-old. So in our training for clerics, and in our training for church workers, we need to ensure that the comfortableness of who they are chronologically also happens with their psychosexual development, that they're on the same page. And right now, communities in formation spend a lot of time on the issue of psychosexual development and the whole idea of what does it mean to be celibate and to be chaste in the 21st century, because though they're not real virtues that are understood by most people, or they're not choices that are made by most people. But it's important that you have the tools to live that charism. Second of all, there is a power struggle within the church. It is strictly hierarchical. I once got accused by a boss that I didn't understand authority. And I started laughing. I said, I'm a Roman Catholic priest. We gave you authority. We made up hierarchy. What, are you kidding me? I mean, you can accuse me of a lot of things, but I understand power. So first and foremost, you have to understand that the individual is oftentimes looked down upon and the collective is more important, okay? But you also have to understand that power rests in individuals. There are such things as councils, synods, conferences, but in the end, the Pope makes decisions, and the local ordinary makes decisions, and the pastor makes decisions. Everybody else is a consultant, okay? We need to look at that seriously, okay? And I'm not the first Roman Catholic to say that, or the first priest to say that. But that really needs to be looked at. Power differential between the priest and the laity. In what job at 26 years of age can you walk into and have immediate respect, look like you're a wise person, and you haven't been around the block once, and get instant respect? Tell me. Roman Catholic clergy. The mystique. And because of that, you never have to struggle to really own authentically what it means to be respected for the gifts and the talents and the shortcomings you have as an individual. And then it leads you to believe, in a sense, that I'm special. We're all special. And by that I don't mean narcissistic or entitled, but we're all unique individuals, and that's important. The other thing is, the clerical culture tends to be all male. You need to have friends outside of clerical circles, I say to priests. You need to know what the price of lettuce is in your supermarket. You need to know what it takes for a family to put gas in their car if they can afford to go on vacation. You need to have a sense of what the world is about, okay? The more distant you become, the more isolated you become, the more you go seeking satisfactions in areas that are dangerous: drugs, alcohol, and sex, okay? And finding your satisfaction there, okay? Finally, the other thing is, when we talk about sexual abuse in the church, we need to really remember that it happens because people are seeking something, okay? They're seeking something out of their own lack in their own lives. They're either lonely, they're disconnected, they're sexually immature, so they're curious. Those are many of the reasons why it happens. You know, in the John Jay study, which was a study that Catholics did on the clergy abuse issue, it was found, and there's debate over this because John Jay used the age of 10 as a pedophile, okay? In the DSM-3, as a clinician, I used the age of 13. Okay, so if you abuse a child under the age of 13, and then you're considered a pedophile. John Jay used the age of 10. There's a lot of discussion on that, but I want to be honest with you folk. It was 3% using their number, okay, 10 and above. It was 3% of the priests who abused. Guess how many of cases of the 3% abused? They abused 24% of the victims known. So you had a 3% population having more than 7 or 8 victims. For the most part, it was one victim, one priest, except for that 3%. And they were the really sick people, and I have stories of those. So I want to say that to you, the sense of this is a problem, yes. It is a massive problem, no. I think most priests go out there and really want to serve you, want to serve the church, want to serve God. They want to do that faithfully, and they do want to do that with a sense of integrity. But we have to realize that we have to protect ourselves and our institutions, and if we don't do that with the pillars that I described to you, then children are at risk. I've seen children at risk in many different situations. When I was doing, maternal child health, I was walking into apartments in Boston where mothers left needles out on tables that a toddler could pill and get infected. I worked in situations where, this is a true story, of a mother leaving a kid with a 4-year-old with a broken leg and an infant in a crib while she went shopping. Okay? Those are situations where children are not safe. And they're not safe because there was reason. For the mother, it was her drug addiction. That was the first and foremost thing in her life. The second one, it was a mother who really needed to get food and had no friends, no opportunities to get somebody in that apartment to babysit. So there are reasons why kids get abused. Okay? But there are ways that we can make environments and organizations safer if we pay attention and we're responsible to each other for how we interact with that child. So I think, in my estimation, I believe with the cooperation of Presidium and the religious communities that I work with, including the Brothers of Holy Cross who run this institution, that as an accredited agency, they know the right things to do. The important thing is that they do it, that they follow through. And oftentimes that's what breaks down in organizations, is that the leadership fails to hold each other responsible. We're too nice. The gospel says nothing about being nice. It's about loving people, caring for people. And sometimes that is messy and it's not nice. So hopefully, you'll leave here with a sense of confidence that the church that you belong to and where you worship and where you want your children to worship will in fact be a safe environment that preaches the gospel in a way that encourages self-affirmation, self-confidence, and a realization that they're lovable and are capable of love.
You know what 8 minutes is? Well, thank you very much, each of you. While we are gathering the cards, so if we could, if you have a question on one of the cards, Casey's going to be and Austin are kind of working the crowd right now. So just hold that up so that they can see it and come to you. And then I'm going to ask a delaying question or two while we get those up here. So I think just the first question is just maybe for each one of you, if you haven't already said so, what led you to this particular topic and concern, interest? And I'll let you guys fight it out. Who wants to go first?
Well, I came upon it as a journalist. A lot of people ask me, what kind of religious upbringing did you have? I was born into a Jewish family. We were not very religious. I call it kind of watered down Judaism. We never talked about God. I think the first time that, I saw a copy of the Old Testament was, in a motel room, and we had a Christmas tree every year. So it wasn't part of my personal experience, but as a journalist, I was always looking for issues that I felt needed to be addressed because they were not really being addressed and they weren't being very understood. So it was really just from, reading about cases in the newspaper. I went back and forth on this a lot, questioning myself and asking whether this was really a serious problem. In the Catholic Church, majority of cases that we were hearing about in the news were, 20, 30 years old. I was wondering if it was really a serious problem today. And I came across some more cases, but still was playing devil's advocate with myself. And then I ran across an article. I don't know if this is still working. Can you hear what I'm saying? All right. Then I ran across a blurb in the New York Times about a small religious group called One Mind Ministries, in which a toddler had been starved to death. And this was perpetrated by the entire household of people, including his mother. And I think that really kind of sent me over the edge and led me to want to write about it.
I'll try to use this mic if it's working well enough. Again, as I mentioned in my talk, I spent so much time as quite an open minister in the way that I talk and live and have a different viewpoint than many ministers might be perceived as having. I had a lot of people who had come to me and felt safe being open about who they were, what they believed, and what they struggled with. And I began to hear repeatedly stories of religious maltreatment and saw the impact that it had on people. And then also as a hospice chaplain, again, I would be sometimes in the last few hours of a person's life with them and would see them experiencing great turmoil and great difficulty and fear and anxiety. And in each of those cases, there was some form of religious maltreatment or trauma that they had experienced that had them feeling incredibly frightened. And I was giving a talk about a year and a half ago, or about a year ago, I guess, and a friend heard me use the term religious PTSD. I've actually been working on doing some writing in that area, and she said, "You need to meet Janet Heimlich," and the rest is history. So I'm glad to be able to work with Jan and continuing to see what we can do to help people bring about the best and fight the worst. So.
I'm a former elementary school teacher before I entered the community. I entered the community when I was 27 years old, so I spent a number of years teaching elementary school. Then as a priest for the first 2 years of my priesthood, I taught high school. And then after that, I went to social work school, and I thought I'd go back to the high school and do school social work. Surprise, surprise, I ended up at the visiting nurses working with pregnant addicts. And that's really kind of just led me from there to other ministries I've had, other jobs I've had. But I started out as an elementary school teacher, who are mandated reporters.
Okay, as we're sorting through questions, we're living in a religiously pluralistic society in the United States that's growing, that pluralism is growing each day, and we are having new groups come to the United States bringing various religious traditions that we're possibly just not familiar with and such like that. How do we as a culture adapt to this growing religious pluralism, particularly when there are practices that we may view as harmful or whatever, and how do we balance religious freedom, which we value so much in this country, with what is perceived as possibly abuse?
Well, I think it firstly starts with being welcoming and tolerant and open-minded and not prejudicial. A lot of the reasons why we see, just to take one example, Muslim communities being very insular and rejecting, for example, reporting abuse or having some problems having to do with their teachings, physical abuse. We have seen some honor killings in this country. It's because so many Americans have persecuted them, and I feel like I don't know the answer to that except just for faith communities probably to be more welcoming of different faiths and more ecumenical, so that there's just a little bit more openness to welcoming people of different faiths. I think if we were to do more in that regard, then we wouldn't have these insulated communities where some pretty terrible stuff can be going on.
I just realized we have it easy because there's nobody for you to look to the right to pass the buck to as we're doing this process. There's a story that Janet tells about an investigator who went knocking on doors when he heard about abuse that was happening in an Amish community. And it happened that one of the doors that he knocked on turned out to be some of the elders of the Amish community. And as this investigator talked with the leaders and learned about their culture and their faith and more of what they believed and what their processes were, there developed this relationship of mutuality and respect and trust. And from that, this long-standing relationship developed so that even today, if there is a suspicion of abuse within their community, the elders know someone that they can call, who they trust, isn't going to come in with guns blazing, but will come in a respectful and gentle way, using that relationship as the vehicle through which they can investigate what is happening and respond together as a group. At our next conference, our second conference will be coming at the end of this year, and one of the speakers is a specialist who trains clinicians, social workers, therapists, and others of how to engage with persons of different faiths and cultures because of this very particular issue of how do you engage with folks in a way that doesn't just so shut them down and send them further entrenched into being isolated that we lose any chance of working with them to help protect children. So if you get a chance to come to that conference, it'll be a great opportunity to hear someone who spends her career exactly helping clinicians and law enforcement know how to do just that.
Is that child-friendly?
If you go to childfriendlyfaith.org, then the information about the upcoming conference is listed there, and would love to have all of you there. It's held here in Austin. It'll be a great day-and-a-half event, very reasonably priced, and I'm sure Jan would love to talk with you more about it afterwards.
I think we're naive if we think that people within religious organizations aren't critical of what they believe. I think there's a reflection process in every person who believes in a deity or is in membership in the church. So my take on this is a little bit different. I think there's a responsibility for theologians to really be serious about what they do and to say things that need to be said and to understand that why from an intellectual capacity. Because I think, from our ideas we build our behaviors, and from our behaviors we decide whether they're right or wrong. So I think I put a lot of emphasis on communities trying to figure out, to articulate what we believe and why we believe it and how that influences my actions.
This is for Reverend Dr. Carla, but I think it could be for everyone. And I'm going to add a little bit too, is how do you deal with people using the Bible as justification to preach that homosexuality is harmful? I also might add to that, how do we deal with differing interpretations of scriptures? I think of the slide that Janet had up there of Jesus, and this, leave your mother, leave your father, and that I would never read that story so literally, but if you did, you could get that interpretation very easily. So how do we deal with, even within a tradition, the differing interpretations of scripture and how to read those things?
I've had just a little bit of practice with that. As an openly gay minister, I'm someone who, and again, because I'm hard to offend, a lot of people seem to feel comfortable coming and talking to me because they trust that I'm not going to blast them if they believe in a way that's different than I do. I also have the advantage of having lived in that more conservative culture that uses that form of biblical literalism as a form of interpretation, and even though that's far afield from where I am now, I understand it. And so I'm grateful to be in a unique position to kind of stand in the gap, bless you, to kind of stand in the gap and understand where both sides are coming from. If you choose to call them sides, I don't like that. But I choose not to engage in debate. I will engage in dialogue. If someone wants to understand better where I'm coming from and can listen and think through and say, well, okay, but what about, well, I don't understand, well, help me with, I can do that all day long if there's respectful dialogue. When it enters to the point where I'm not being heard, I'm just trying to be convinced, they're trying to convince me to believe in a different way, I will say, my brother, my sister, I wish that you would go in peace and go. Sorry. I wish that you go in peace because this is about me and my life. And my life and how I feel and how I understand God is not up for debate. I will discuss it with you. Come, let us reason together. But I cannot and will not engage in debate, which for me, given my experiences, can feel very destructive. I think there's a place for it. But particularly around this issue, I am more about having conversation. I have my own views of Scripture, and I don't need to shove those down anyone's throat. I can understand where people believe differently. But all that I ask is that even if you don't agree with me, is that you still honor what I believe is a mandate from God to treat one another with respect and with love, and to not use Scripture to justify treating me in any way as less than. You may not agree with me, but that does not give justification to use faith as a weapon to somehow give the ultimate trump card that I am less than worthy. And I'm grateful to be able to stand in that place.
Well, I think we want to try to do two things. One is, eventually have people draw from Scripture messages that allow them to feel that they can perceive children in a positive way and treat them well. I think to start that out, whoever is in dialogue with faith communities has to be a member of that community in some way to start out. Otherwise, no one's going to listen to anybody. But once that happens, I think that the first thing really that has to take place is education. It's amazing how many people don't really understand what abuse is or what neglect is. And, I've been talking to a couple of women who they go to Nigeria and they work with midwives. And they know that a lot of these midwives are genitally cutting girls. They don't just start out by saying, you shouldn't do that. They just teach them about what the body goes through when they're scarring and what kind of harm can result from that. And then the midwives decide on their own, I don't want to do that anymore. So I think that you have to set it up with education. There has to be first their comfort level of the person being part of their community, education about abuse and neglect. And then what I think happens ideally is that those individuals, they find Scripture on their own that's going to support treating people well. I don't think we have to kind of show it to them necessarily.
I'm academically trained in theology, and I at times work from the neck up, though I think I'm pretty well integrated with my heart and my head. But I talk in the sense of somebody who studied graduate theology. Scripture is studied like any other literature. There's genres to it, there's historical fact, there's myth in part of it. It was written by human beings that are inspired to tell a story, that God is interactive in the world. And the grace of their writing is the fact that they're centered on how God is acting. So, you read a story and you hopefully bring it into the 21st century. So in a world that Abraham lived in, that Isaac lived in, sacrificing Isaac, Jacob sacrificing Isaac, is a world where children died every day. They died of starvation, they died because the weather was poor, they would drive because they were nomads, there was disease. So the idea of sacrificing a child, or the loss of a child, is very different. My experience is that I worked in pediatric hospice, and I was said so many other times by people, it's so terrible to lose a child, it's tragic, and it is. It's the worst thing a parent can go through. They never expect to bury their children. But the reality is children are dying all over the world, and people are surviving it. The important thing is, how do we grieve? How do we move on? The same is true about Scripture. We have to look at it as inspired. But I'm not about to cut off my arm because it offends me. Or pluck out my eye. Okay? That's exaggeration. It's a literary form. It's used for a reason. The people who wrote Scripture are intelligent and inspired.
All right. So understanding that child abusers were once abused children themselves, is this correct? And how can the cycle be stopped? And I pose an additional question with that. Are persons who are abusers on the grounds of religious abuse, is that a cycle that they're repeating as well? There's
a model in social work or in child development called the world of abnormal rearing. You're probably all familiar with it. And it's about how children are reared in a way that the child becomes the parent and the child ends up answering the needs of the parent versus you taking care of the child. And because of that, the child ends up with a completely screwed up view of reality and their responsibilities, their confidence. It's a major thing that affects development in children. The same is true if one is abused. It's the same sort of world of abnormal rearing that one thinks that this is what happens to children, that children are in fact sexual objects and can be used as sexual objects. But that doesn't necessarily that everybody who was sexually abused as a child will in fact abuse. The most abusers were abused as children. But it's not, the argument that, oh, if you're abused, you're going to be an abuser. And for a lot of kids, that scares them in adolescence because they were abused at 8, and their big fear when they're sexually curious and things like that is, am I going to abuse somebody? Is this to me? So do you understand the distinction?
Okay. This one's for you, Father George. Okay. It's going back to your comment about Italy not requiring priests to reveal when there's been abuse, and that the Vatican runs out of Italy, so primarily sets the example of the rest of the world in regards to the Catholic Church. So does this, by default, make it appear like it's okay for that type of practice? And the question is really, how do we lobby for change in another country as an outsider?
Well, I think the first thing you have to realize is the church gets legal advice from Italian lawyers. Okay, so that's the first and foremost you need to know. The church people do pay attention to lawyers, and that's what got us into trouble in many cases. I'll be very frank with you about that. So, as I always say, child abuse is immoral, illegal, and sinful. So why do you want to be any one of those things? So the question I put the Italian clergy is, why wouldn't you report this? Why wouldn't you protect this child? And I think sooner or later they'll get the message, because Francis is a very different kind of pope, but that sort of an answer is not acceptable. But one of the things is you have to realize that the church gets legal counsel, and in Italy if it says who are mandated reporters. I've been a mandated reporter since I was 21 years of age, when I got my teaching license. So I'm 62 years of age now. This is not new to me. I've called child services. I know how it operates. Okay? It's part of my world. I don't think twice about picking up a phone and calling if I find a kid is abused, or I think a child is abused. So I think in time it comes. But again, in Italy, you have to look at their culture too. Family is supreme. Would the Italian Americans in the group here agree? La familia. You don't go against the family. I see some people smiling. So.
For me, that brings up an interesting point, because one of the things I frequently say is that it is challenging. You mentioned in your talk, Father George, that it is challenging for there to be abuse that occurs without there being a lack of a careful guardian that is watching out for the needs of the child as well. And so it is very easy for us, and let's take within Christianity, to speak of abuses that happen, and yet it is hard for abuse to happen unless there are others who are remaining silent. And so if we want to point fingers about abuse that's happening, we get to then look at our part about where are we not speaking out? Are we being a part of the silent majority that is not saying something is wrong here, and we need an alternative voice to speak and provide a prophetic witness that says there is a problem? And so it is not just about being nice. And throughout again, in the Christian tradition, the Hebrew Scriptures, often called the Old Testament, the tradition of that prophetic witness that comes up and says, now today they might look like the schizophrenics on the street corner, the way they act and they live and they speak, but it was the prophetic witness of God saying something is not right here. You are not doing well. You've left the way of caring for the widows and orphans and the least in our community. And God is not happy. And so I think there's a need for more of us to be willing to speak out and up and speak in that prophetic voice, because if we do not, if we are silent, then there's a legal term, I won't try the Latin, that says basically he who is silent is said to consent. And so we who remain silent, we become part of the entire problem if we don't speak up. So we don't get to just point the finger elsewhere. So we get to speak up and lobby and say something is not right here and we need to do something different.
And please don't construe my statement about the Italian bishops and legal systems that I agree with them, I don't. I think they're mandated reporters, they should report. There's no, it's not even a question in my mind.
Well, one criticism that I've had with former popes, particularly Pope Benedict, because he oversaw the office of the, am I getting it right? The office of the Doctrine of the Faith, is that right? That office is what reviewed just about every child sexual abuse case that was in the church. What I thought was so powerful about what Pope Francis has done is insisted that there were women on the panel. It was really important to have a survivor, but by having women on the panel, he was essentially shaking up the hierarchy. He was recognizing that what has allowed this to be happening for so long, and they've been archiving cases of sexual abuse since the year 400, is that the hierarchy was wanting to keep the power structure in place. And the other thing that was brought to my attention by a Houston attorney, grew up as an altar boy. He was not abused himself, but he actually subpoenaed Pope Benedict, and shortly after that he became Pope. But anyway, he looked into some of the archived documents, having the ability to read Latin. He was able to translate these and so forth. And what he was telling me was that when they were talking about crimes against children, sins, and that sort of thing, they would talk about sinning with a child. Sorry, this is cutting out. Sinning with a child, not against a child. So I kind of attribute that there were just a very long time where there was just really not recognition that there was a perpetrator/victim relationship going on.
I'll take it one step further. From the early portion when this became public, the first thing that becomes obvious when you start looking at the data is that the hierarchy or the bishops paid very little attention to the victims. The victims were treated miserably. They were really treated poorly. And it's only really in the litigation that, you know, they wise up, but also because other people are saying, this is not our character, this is not our church. We don't treat people that you've abused and neglected and called all sorts of false names. You don't treat them this way. And the other thing too, it had us look and understand, what does it mean to be a victim? I mean, the survivors of sexual abuse, there are certain dynamics that, you know, you don't go around the next day and tell somebody I've been abused. You may work up the courage to face that fact 40 years later. So I think, you know, there was a real step to kind of how do we intervene? And canon law favors priests' rights in certain areas, and they favor bishops' rights in certain areas, and you need a good canon lawyer to get right down the middle. But I always say the one that was left out of the picture was the victims. Yeah. They weren't paid attention to. They weren't respected. They weren't offered the help they needed early on. Now they are. But it's only because they're kicking and screaming that they demanded it. They demanded to be treated like human beings.
Okay. Next question. How can parents be sure that they are part of a faith community that is not harmful to children and understands their needs?
Towards the end of my book, I have about 3 pages of questions specifically for parents to ask themselves about whether or not they're raising a child in an authoritarian community. And I can't go through, you know, all of them right now, but I mean, some of the areas have to do with, for example, the parents' comfort level. I think I might need to borrow it in the right. Thank you. The parents' comfort level when they are concerned about abuse going on in the community in terms of approaching a religious authority figure. If they have concerns, for example, that a child is undergoing too much corporal punishment, do they feel comfortable talking to their faith leader about it? If they want to report the abuse, do they feel comfortable talking to the faith leader about it? Or do they think that they're going to be shunned in some way or discouraged from going to the police and that kind of thing? Or how would they be treated if they were to go to the police? I think that there are some other kind of broader issues that go on. For example, authoritarian communities oftentimes believe that they have the only truth, and that people on the outside are misguided, they're evil, they're out to persecute them, and so you have this real us against them kind of attitude. So I think, that's something that would be harmful to, adults as well. I mean, it's just the typical signs of an authoritarian culture. And I guess finally would be where clergy are getting very involved in telling parents how to raise their kids. If they're telling them what to do when they misbehave, if they're telling parents how many kids to have, there have been all kinds of ways that religious organizations will get very much enmeshed in family life instead of trusting the parents to make good, healthy choices for their kids.
Okay, to talk about the designation program here. So as we hear parents asking, how do I find a faith community that's not going to scare the snot out of my children? Then we decided it might be a good idea to put together some principles. So first we developed the Charter for Child-Friendly Faith. What is the bare minimum that persons of all faiths and cultures and belief systems can agree upon about how children should be treated and valued and honored when it comes to faith and cultural practices? So we developed that Charter for Child-Friendly Faith. Some of you may be familiar with Karen Armstrong's Charter for Compassion. It was the same idea. What can we all agree on? And from that foundation, build enough respect and trust that we can then have the more sticky widget conversations that get more tricky and the more gray areas. So first is the Charter for Child-Friendly Faith that we'll be launching through a petition campaign later on this year. That is phase one of what would be a designation program. Phase two would be a lot of training that a faith community can engage in that would ultimately help them review their policies and procedures to make certain, not just from the legal and insurance standpoint, but also from the psychosocial, healthy child development and spiritual perspective, again, that they're handling their children in a way that is the most healthy and productive for them. So to really look at their practices, how are we telling the story of Noah's Ark? Are we telling it in a way that it speaks of promise and love and new beginnings? Or are we telling them that if you're bad enough, God will kill all the puppies and kittens on the planet except for the last two? How do we think about how these stories are being received and heard by small children? And so for parents who are looking for a faith community who's had those conversations, who's dug deeper and learned more about all of these issues that we've talked about tonight, then we'll be asking them to engage in this designation program that's a 3-step process, at the end of which they could then call themselves that they are designated as a child-friendly faith community. And with that information, they can then publicize to folks in their community so parents can go, ooh, they are a child-friendly faith community. What does that mean? I want to find out more. So also for those who've been disillusioned from organized religion and are scared to go, then that might be something that could help faith communities kind of remarket and rebrand and say, some of us are trying to think about these things, and we want to be a place that's safe for families, especially families and children, to come and engage with us. So be looking for that to roll out hopefully by the end of the year.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our 2-hour time, which went very quickly. I'd like to thank our panelists for being willing to put yourselves out there and discuss a very difficult topic. I'd like to thank Dr. Ennis Mitchell in the back for his willingness to bring this to our community and bring this forward. I apologize that we did not get to all the questions. I think we could probably continue this for quite a bit. I think our panelists are receptive to you coming up and asking them questions and such. And Janet, you'll be out front signing books and selling them, and is the cost out there? I think
It's $20.
$20, so if you want to get her book, you can. Let's give them a round of applause again. Thank you.
In one of my lives, I was a college administrator. I'm a former vice president of student affairs, the one who makes all the rules on alcohol. And I just want to say to you all, it is wonderful to see you come out tonight. This is what education is all about, finding a cutting edge, a new idea, something that might intrigue you. Hopefully people have said things that you will engage with, that you'll look at critically, and maybe you'll find your own path how to serve children in a new and special way. So thank you for attending.